take another minute or two, folks, to finish up any last thoughts you have, please. For those of you who are finished, please just pass the papers into the center. And there's the outline in all of the rows, please. So just finish up that one. As you can see, this is just going to be a mini lecture, and we're only going to deal with one civilization. In fact, in this course, the only civilization that will be in South America at all, and this is the Incan Civilization. And really, the Incan Civilization develops toward the end of the period we're looking at. This course, really in the mid-15th century, is when this really ends up becoming a major civilization. That's not to say there's nothing there before. And we do think before you see one huge sort of conquering empire in this region, what you saw before this is a series of much smaller states that then essentially are eaten alive by one dominant power, by the Inca. And then they'll basically take all of what was, nearly all of those, the west coast of South America, and then militarily force it into one huge empire. That altogether will stretch around 2,500 miles, and will be around 11.5 million people being forcibly brought together. So really, at the time, it was it would become one of the largest states in the entire world. You'll notice that when I say coast, I really mean that the basis of their power, where they really were strongest, is close to the coast. The further you get into South America, areas that really would have been completely dominated by rainforests, the less the power of the Inca goes. In fact, they don't really tend to go in that far. Back in the time period we're talking about, when it comes about, the term Inca is actually just in reference to the people who ruled over this empire. But modern day historians now just consider anybody who lived as part of this empire as being Inca as well. What we see in this empire is not only a very coordinated period of conquest from above, we also see an empire that is really quite sophisticated in the kind of administrative techniques that it ends up using. The Inca themselves in addition to having a very strong military presence, also get very good at running an empire as well, about thinking of this sort of machinery of bureaucracy as well. One of the ways that they do this, one of the ways in which they keep this empire after having taken it, is they will encourage obedience to the subject peoples by forcibly taking some of their prime people, the most important people, and keeping them as hostages, with the understanding, of course, that they can be killed if whatever area they came from is not good. They also will end up forming a large class of bureaucrats to oversee all this territory that they've taken, and really have a very strong hierarchical organization of all these people who work for their government. One thing that comes out of this sort of concern with running the empire is that they have one imperial language known as Quechua, a language that had been the initial language of these conquering people that they essentially will force upon the regions that they take, and they will force, it's used in government as well, which is the reason why it becomes so popular. The language, by the way, is still a minority language in Peru today. The other thing that they use, they did not, so far as we can tell, have a system of writing, but they did have a way to be able to keep records, but one that we have not seen in other civilizations up until this point, and that is this thing, which is known as a kwaku. And then that word starts with the letter Q. You may initially, of course, think that this just looks like a necklace, but appearances can be deceptive. And really what this is it is meant to be basically a mnemonic aid to encode information. And so far as we can tell, what the Inca would do with these things is that they would use different colors, different lengths, and knots at strategic places to be able to encode information inside of these structures. And it actually has been a great frustration that we don't have many of these remaining from the Incan world, and so we don't 100% actually know the system that they were using to be able to put information in, and that's been quite frustrating. We suspect, and some people suspect in fact, that there's such a great variety in the examples we do have left over that it's possible that depending upon who was using this individual one, it might have been a little idiosyncratic. They had slightly different systems, which would make it virtually impossible for us to decode. But that's not 100% clear at this point. In terms of what we, from observation, what we think that they used the kwaku for, any information that the government wanted to have at its disposal. For instance, population numbers, taxes that were owed, labor services that were owed. In some cases, we also think historical data as well. All of this could be encoded in these kind of, it's really a unique kind of source. The Inca referred to the territory that they ruled in. All that territory I showed you earlier. It's essentially the land of the four quarters, and they spelled all their territory could be divided up into four big slices. The capital of this, the intersection of where they sort of their district, you might say, was the capital city of Cusco, which is approximately the center of the territory. And this initially, the city of Cusco would have been a city of grandeur. Certainly a city that was the absolute center of everything that the Inca did. It had their administrative offices. It was the center of religion as well. A lot of priests there. And, we know when Europeans saw the city of Cusco for the first time, they really found it to be gorgeous. We know that initially, for instance, there was all kinds of gold out in public, and actually they would also cart sand and put it into the city. And so when the sun hit the city at certain times of the day, it would just glisten more or less. Their first thought was, of course, this is beautiful. The second thought was, we could take this stuff. And then they did that afterwards. We also think initially that there would have been all the principal temples of the Incan world would have been located in the city of Cusco, including, as we'll see later on, especially temples to the sun and moon. The population altogether in the city of Cusco is over 100,000 people. And basically, if you were anybody who lived here, nobles, the rulers, the main priests. But this was also an empire, it's obviously much wider than the capital city. And we see that the Incas spent a lot of time and energy in creating very good roads to be able to basically snake across all of this region. We think that this is important for military purposes. It's also important just to be able to communicate messages. Again, the government cared about doing business, so that they had to be able to talk to one another in various places. And we think altogether, the Inca will actually will create around 14,000 miles worth of road. That's a lot of road building altogether. And, as you can see, some of it, especially the sort of stone parts, are still in existence today. But we know that they really pull off some engineering feats along the way. For instance, they actually know how to create all sorts of rope bridges that will go over rivers, for instance, or gorges. They seem to work just fine. One thing, however, that they did not have was horses. If you wanted to communicate messages, you had to go on foot. And so, in fact, it was very important that these roads actually be managed quite well. And what we think that the Inca would do to be able to communicate messages, because you couldn't simply rely upon horses, was that they would have relay runners, basically. And they would space them out strategic points if they had, and then they could carry messages from one point to the next, just by the blood, sweat, and tears of someone running. We also think that having these roads meant that this was just one of the main paths to creating unification of this territory, which previously had really been entirely independent. The Inca, obvious to us in their government, that they have a very strong monarchy, and it's clear to us that they felt that ultimately the king was descended from the sun. So there's sort of a divine link there as well, a special divine power. Everyone, of course, would really like to know exactly how this monarchy comes into being, and really, even more broadly, what was the process by which the Inca began this time of conquest? But as I said, one of the real problems that all historians who study the Inca face is not having written sources really limits how much we can comment upon the sort of earlier period of their history. What we do have is the Spaniards also will come into contact with the Inca. So we have observations that they have, and in some cases too, the Spaniards even will collect some stories that the Inca themselves told about what their prehistory was. We don't tend to trust a lot of this information, though, because it's self-serving, and it tends to glorify the current regime in power. So, in fact, according to the version of the history by the rulers of the Inca, all of these other people in South America were basically causing all sorts of problems, and then the Inca just has to put all these people down to save the territory, but not out of interest, their own interests, which sounds to us suspicious. Please.
So because we don't have many sources, and because the sources that we have are from like Spaniards, where do we get all this other information about the civilization?
I mean, so a lot of it is really just purely through physical sort of archaeology, seeing what items we have, but that does lead to a lot of limitations. I mean, you're seeing one of it in the kind of these origin myths, which is to say that there are times we suspect that the information we have is bad from the Spaniards, but we can't prove it necessarily. So there's something determinacy there occasionally. So in all of the stories that we have, and in fact, at least at this point, we don't tend to doubt this one point. One of the central emperors or kings who's very systematic in the process of creating a huge empire is this guy known as Pachacuti. A person who was known primarily for being a warrior emperor, being a general. The name that he had, Pachacuti, is actually a description. The term, it was basically a nickname he was given. It means earth shaker. And in effect, there's was a story circulating around about him that at one point he needed more soldiers to be able to fight, and he actually stamps his feet in the earth, and stones themselves rise up and fight on the behalf of his military. We tend to think Pachacuti really leads these extremely brutal campaigns against other parts of the empire. Doing things like, for instance, in the middle of summer, cutting off the water supply of certain people and letting them die off, and then just invading them and killing them all off. There was also a lighter side to Pachacuti, though. After he takes these places, there really is this, he's the one to begin to set into motion a lot of facets of their government, including regular taxes, roads, creating a system of labor that people were forced to do for the government. Weirdly enough, for many of the civilizations we've seen, the emperor in the Incan Empire is not just a matter of giving the title to the eldest son, which you might expect. In fact, any male member of the ruling family could take over the position of emperor upon the death of the old emperor. Theoretically, they just chose whoever was most competent, although what we imagine this meant on the ground was that a lot of infighting before anyone could actually decide on the next emperor. And there are actually a lot of different people who could potentially become emperor because the emperors tended to have a lot of different wives. So that meant there were a lot of people with potential royal blood in them who might have to duke it out at the end of the death of the old emperor. A lot of our sources about this civilization and every civilization we've seen come from the upper class, nobles, and priests. Who wore the best clothing, especially this kind of embroidered clothing, who also wore extremely big earrings. They ended up having, in fact, just as many people do gauges, they have these ears that eventually would become like big loops because they wore such huge earrings on them. Led the Spaniards to refer to them as big ears, which is not terribly nice. We think that priests at this time tend to have these very privileged lives. They were supposed to lead lives of really kind of a harsh life, celibate life, in charge of education and rituals. Most people in this civilization were peasants who tended to live in small communities. In addition to doing their own farming, they would also be required to work on the land of nobles for free. And again, as always with the Inca, this was all very well managed. Whenever they had more than they needed to eat, they had a system of bringing some of that surplus and just putting it into storehouses to be able to use in times of emergency. So it actually was very well run. We also see that peasants, they really got it both ways. Not only did they have to work on nobles' land, private nobles, but they also had to do free labor for the government. The term they used was mita. In essence, whenever any kind of project had to be done, think about roads, think about building things in cities, building new buildings. Think about, for instance, serving in the army. They would just call upon peasants to do that, and they wouldn't get any money in exchange. They occasionally would get sort of like entertainment. That was basically all you would get for working for the government. We also see that not only did the peasants constantly get forced to do labor, the government also had they had no hesitation when they needed new land to be farmed. They would simply uproot peasant communities and force them to go to a completely new area. This also, whenever they suspected any subject people of rebellion, they would also do the same exact thing. They just force people to go to some different place. So really, again, this is kind of a hands-on government altogether. Some people in this civilization did full-time service for the government. They were government employees. Perhaps one of the most interesting groups is a group of women known as the Mamakuna. Mamakuna were sometimes referred to as virgins of the sun. These were women, very, in some ways, similar to nuns, in our terms, who had to, first of all, lead a celibate life, and they were supposed to be really dedicated to the sun god. And in fact, they lived very well, for the most part. Their lives were one of privilege and status and money, but they theoretically were not supposed to. They're not supposed to have sex. I should say, by the way, that the Inca at times, we know that some of the other areas in South America they wanted to forge alliances with. Occasionally, when they needed someone to marry off into an important marriage alliance, they actually would draw upon these virgins from the sun. Theoretically, they could actually say for sure that they were still virgins. So, in fact, there was actually one exception to their celibacy. In addition to other things, we think that the Mamakuna had to weave things, and especially weaving and specific patterns would be associated with people who had money, or nobles or priests. So, in fact, they knew specific patterns that went to different people. They would also brew this form of corn beer. You can actually, by the way, brew corn. Apparently, make alcohol. And this would be given to Incan nobles at festivals. And there were also other people who worked for the government like that. There were people who, for instance, just tended llamas as a source of beef. It was a good job to have altogether. We also see, to some degree, there's long-distance trade in this civilization, but it tends to be done exclusively by the government. And it's very interesting that when they make all sorts of goods, like artisan goods, they do trade them, but again, it has to strictly go through government hands. You can't do it privately at all. The other thing that often interests people in studying Inca is that they obviously were a religious people. This is something that hit some of the Spaniards initially coming over, and that they immediately saw, for instance, that they had, in order to honor some of their relatives, they actually would mummify them. And in a rather strange, macabre sort of gesture, some of these Spaniards chose to bring back some of these mummies with them to Spain. Sort of interesting gift for your wife. In any case, in more serious terms, they obviously tried to keep up this profound relationship with their ancestors even after death. They felt that by coming to their dead remains and praying with them, their dead ancestors could help them with the gods, sort of be intermediaries, intercessors for them. And they would give them all sorts of items, food and drink to be able to help effectuate that. Altogether, the Inca show a lot of respect for nature. They worship it, especially the sun god. But anything like in the heavens, the moon, the stars, the planets, then even some things close to Earth, like rain. All of these things were basically shot through with the divine, and you wanted to stay on their good side. You wanted to be able to pray to them and stay close in relationship. In terms of like big name gods, one of the few ones it's important to keep in mind is this guy here known as Viracocha, who was an extremely powerful god, who's believed to be the creator of the world, the universe even, and all humans within it. And as we've seen many times in this course, there clearly is a very close relationship between rulers and religion. And so, for instance, the Emperor Pachacuti, who we talked about, was very devoted to Viracocha, and this is one of the gods that he's been praised a lot. The emperor himself was seen to be descended from the sun. He was really, in our terms, a god king. And this makes him really incapable of making mistakes, which is kind of a dangerous thing to have in a ruler, or the belief that, of course, he couldn't make mistakes. And really, just as the sun touched all things, so did the emperor own all things in the empire. As I've seen in we do think that the Inca do practice sacrifice. All of you will be very happy to learn, however, they do not sacrifice human beings, except in times of great stress, in which case they sacrifice humans, so maybe you won't be relieved at all. Small should actually sacrifice humans, but also children in particular at times of stress. But that is only in times of crisis. Normally, they will only sacrifice llamas, which I don't think any of you are really all that worked up about. We also see, too, that I mentioned that priests are important, but there really is a very strong moral dimension to some of the Inca beliefs. They believe, for instance, in something that's very close to our terms of sin. I mean, it's something, doing wrong deeds, which they felt had repercussions for the world and its order. They believe in a form of life after death, that people could be both rewarded or punished in the afterworld. And they actually have something that looks remarkably like confession, where people would go to priests and they would tell them their sins, and then the priest would help to sort of bring people back into good relationships with the gods. All of these things combined meant that when the Spaniards came, they really felt that they were kind of like a version of the same religion. That people just had to be brought a little bit further along to be able to convert to Catholicism. All right, folks, we'll continue on Friday. Thank you.